Everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 17th of February. Today I'm going to be talking about mainly the Bakhmut front, but also focusing on Marinka and the Oskil front. So before I start, I want to just say that I removed the side panel to the left of the screen, so I hope everybody enjoys that. Now let's actually get into the situation in Marinka, which is pretty interesting. So we have some footage that was geolocated, which shows that the Russians were being targeted by Ukrainians in the warehouse area in northern Marinka. So this is where a lot of the heavy fighting is going on right now. Ukraine has control of part of the agricultural enterprise, although the Russians were able to take out some of the eastern warehouses. So this means that the Russians now have a spearhead in the northern parts of Marinka, and they're able to begin trying to flank the town of Marinka. So I'm going to explain how they're trying to do that. But before I begin, I want to say that this circle over here, which is an area of about 2 residential blocks, is actually under Ukrainian control. This was probably originally being attacked by the Russians, but according to the Russian source military maps, it is now under Ukrainian control. And so nobody's actually alleging that it is under Russian control. So my bad for having it as marked red. I need to remove that once I find the polygon. But what we do know is actually going on is that the Russians were able to advance past the apartment complex, cross this road that connects across the Horovka to Marinka, and then reach the agricultural enterprises, which is one of the main Ukrainian military positions in the northern outskirts of Marinka. So now this is still contested, but if it falls, then the Russians will have a stronghold to the north of Marinka, and they will be able to push to the south where you have the northern residential blocks. There are some pretty large apartments over here, and then you have some Ukrainian groupings in the northern blocks, northern residential districts of Marinka. So once all of that is consolidated and the front line is around the ponds, then the Ukrainian grouping in the center of Marinka will be under pressure from 3 different sides. Obviously, there's fighting going on to the east, and then there will be pressure from the south, from the north, and then from the south, you're seeing attempts by the Russians to flank the Ukrainian grouping. So they're attacking the agricultural enterprises and the tire manufacturing plant. And it has not been successful yet, but if it is, then that would threaten to cut off the pretty sizable Ukrainian grouping in the town of Marinka, and so they may have to retreat to a secondary line, which would probably be around this narrow piece of land that is in between the 2 ponds. There are some defensive fortifications that are set up over here, and they're probably being dug at the moment. And so the fall of Marinka, although it would be a loss for Ukraine because it is one of their main defensive nodes along the contact line, it would not be the end of the world for their defensive positions in this localized area. Now, moving on to the situation in Ivanivske, before we move on to Bakhmut, the Ukrainians were able to conduct a localized counterattack over here. They were able to advance 1 kilometer to the south. So originally the front line looked a bit like this, where the Wagner group was able to take the entire forest. They're attacking the outskirts of Ivanivske, and they were in control of the T-0504 highway, cutting it off physically. So ever since that happened, the Wagner group actually stopped applying pressure to the north. They were not able to cross the road and attack the forested areas because this is one of Ukraine's main defensive fortifications in this area. They have a lot of defenses to the forests, and it's also one of the higher elevated areas. Just this general area around COUNTERATTCK, it is very difficult to assault frontally, and so the Wagner group just stopped once they reached the road. And so there was like a good 2-week period where the Ukrainians were able to regroup and begin pushing back the Wagner group. And this happened at a time when they put a greater emphasis on the situation on Paraskoviivka, and we're going to get into that later. But as we were distracted with the situation in the north, the Ukrainians had an opportunity, and they were able to cross the road and take over some of the positions that the Wagner group had taken in the forested area. And so this, again, is just a localized counterattack. But what this does mean is that the Ukrainian garrison in Ivanivske will not be forced to retreat just yet. They can still stay there and continue to build up defenses. It also means that they probably could connect to Bakhmut through this road, but it will still be under heavy Russian fire, and I don't think that there really could be any sort of logistical connection between the Ukrainian groupings in Konstantinivka and COUNTERATTCK and Ivanivske through this road, because it is still incredibly close to the front line, and so it could easily be fired upon by Russians. Also, there was a demolition over here. I think it was the Ukrainians who destroyed the bridge that's going across the water canal, and so even if they wanted to, the Ukrainians couldn't use it anymore. But yeah, this does show that Ukraine is still like partaking in an active defense, trying to push back the Russian advances as much as possible. Whenever they see a certain weak point, they're pushing over, they're exploiting it just to set back the Russians a couple of weeks, a couple of days even sometimes, just in order to prevent a larger breakdown. And so this is one of their ways of securing the flanks. At the same time, their northern flank is beginning to fall apart. So let's talk about this. Last time that I made a video about Paraskoviivka, situation looked sort of like this. The Russians were beginning to take control of the northern residential areas, and they also took control of Krasnohora. And so the line of fighting was around the Bakhmutovka River, but the Russians also had control of this bulge around the garden center, which extended further to the south and to the west around the northern district of Bakhmut called Stupchi. And so since then, the Russians, and specifically the Wagner Group, have pushed towards the E40 highway, which is this road over here, which was connecting the wider Ukrainian garrison in Donbass to Bakhmut from the north. And it was also a means by which the Paraskoviivka could have been supplied. So once the Russians reached this area, they had control of basically all the routes leading into Paraskoviivka, either physically or through fire control, because they were taking over the hills to the north of Paraskoviivka that could be used to fire upon the convoys that would be used to resupply Paraskoviivka. And so at that point, the Ukrainian command probably realized that it was a lost cause defending the town. And so I think maybe like 2 weeks ago, they already started with this. They began a gradual withdrawal from the town. This is what I believe. I don't have proof of this, but it would just make sense. So originally there were reports that there were about 4,000 Ukrainian troops in this like general area. But by the time that they retreated earlier today, there were probably only about 1,000 left. And they all made their way to the area on Bakhmut because there was still a narrow bulge that they could use to retreat from. So this narrow path over here is what they used, and they just advanced across the open fields. They couldn't really use any roads because most of them had been either physically or cut off just by fires. So by fire control, sorry. So that's the situation around Paraskoviivka. The Ukrainians are beginning to build up a new line around Bakhmut. The issue is that it is on a pretty low elevation. You can see over here this valley. It is on lower elevation compared to the Russian positions that were just taken to the northwest of Paraskoviivka. There's a hill over here that is, I think it is about 200 meters above sea level versus the valley in Bakhmut. So it's going to be pretty easy for the Russians to fire upon the Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut. Also, they didn't have that much time to set up the defensive positions over here. Maybe that about 2 weeks since the situation in Paraskoviivka really got dire, and that's really when Ukraine started building fortifications over here. That's really not enough time to create a new stable defensive line that will be permanent. But maybe it is just enough to hold the Russians at bay for just enough time to build a new line further to the south around a town like Yahidny. I guess the issue is once Yahidny is taken, there really aren't any towns in between the Russians and Hromove. And Hromove is the one town that is connecting the wider Ukrainian logistical and just military structure to Bakhmut. So this is where you have Chasiv Yar, and then the road leads from there into Bakhmut directly. And so by taking Yahidny, the only thing in between the Russians and Hromove would just be a few open fields. So that's the threat of the entire northern flank falling. That would basically be the end of Bakhmut. They would have to retreat from there, the Ukrainians. And then they'd actually have to set up the new defensive positions around the water canal, as I talked about before. But let's not get into that. Let's just focus on the front line. On the front line, we have new geolocated footage of the 30th Brigade hitting the Wagner Group. So the 30th Brigade, if you remember, the 30th Mechanized Brigade, they were previously stationed around Paraskoviivka. They were moved sometime over the past few weeks to the town of Zaliznianske. And now they have released footage of themselves hitting the advancing Wagner detachments as they were trying to assault the town of Zaliznianske. So why would they assault this town? It's because once this town falls, the second Ukrainian defensive line in this region would fall. The first line was around this road over here to the west of Bladatne. Once that fell, they tried to retreat to the valley around Parasokiivka, which sort of makes this sort of like semicircle shape with its perimeter. And so that's the new line where a lot of Ukrainian units are stored. But once the town of Zhelezhnyansk falls, there really isn't any way for the Ukrainians to coordinate any sort of organized defense. And so the Russians could try to cut them off by going towards the north, towards Bodarne, or they could try to go more towards the west and attack the E40 highway and cut off more of Ukrainians' logistics and supply routes, just further harassing the Ukrainian rear. And so they will have a lot of options in this area, especially because it is just open fields and it is on a relatively low elevation. So that's why Ukrainians are trying to pin down, contain the Russian advances in this area. All in all, the situation hasn't really changed much throughout the rest of the front line, though. If we go up, the Russians were able to take the rest of Paraskoviivka in the northern Oskil front. And this happened because the Ukrainians were forced to withdraw following really months of fighting in this area, but it really died down for a while. But Russia was able to resume their high volumes of shelling in the past few weeks. And after some assaults on the town of Paraskoviivka, they forced the Ukrainians to retreat across the river. Now they have fully consolidated control over the town. Really the only Ukrainian positions in this general area that are still to the east of the Oskil River are in the forested area to the west of Liman Pershi. So this is where you have the 109th Attached Territorial Defense Brigade. And so the Russians will have to clear out this dense forest and take the town of Parasokiivka. Besides that, the Ukrainians have all retreated to the town of Frichna, which is again one of these Ukrainian nodes of for the military, which will have to be dislodged if the Russians want to comfortably set up positions near the Oskil River. And again, this is all trying to culminate in Russia trying to assault the city of Kupiansk again, something which we've been anticipating for a while, but can't happen until the northern flank is secured and until a town like Sinkivka is taken, because this is the main Ukrainian defensive line at the moment. It is the one along the front line, and then there's another secondary line around Parasokiivka that is being set up around some of these ditches. So yeah, that's really the situation in northern Oskil. Before I end the video, I want to talk about some changes to the Russian command structure. So we all know that in the central military district, the former commander was Alexander Lapin. He was responsible for the Russians taking over Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So he did have some successes to his credit, but he also had numerous failures under his command, specifically around the Kharkiv offensive, where Ukraine was able to steamroll the Russian forces, take Balaklia, Izium, and reach Liman, taking it, although they never were able to take Kremina. A lot of this can't really be blamed on Lapin because he doesn't really have control over the full extent of troop distributions across the front line. He really only has control over his military district. But again, a lot of the people ended up blaming him, even like Ramzan Kadyrov. He was blaming Lapin and says that the Ministry of Defense was sort of providing him with cover, trying to protect him from criticism. But either way, ever since Lapin leaving the position of commander of the military district, the position has been vacant. But very recently, the Russians appointed Andrei Mordichev to be the new commander of the military district. So Central Military District, if we open up the map of all this, which is provided to us by the Institute for the Study of War, Central Military District, as it is depicted and named, it is in the central part of Russia. This is where their units are stationed. And then you also have Western, Northern, Eastern, and Southern. And so this district, if you look at its history in Ukraine, it's mainly fighting around the Seversk front at the moment. So around Bilohorivka and Spirny, and also around Kremina, and if you go up around Svatove and around Oskil. So that's really where they're situated. And so I really don't know much about Andrei Mordichev. The only thing that we really know is that he's a lieutenant general and that he's formerly been in command of the 28th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. He was in command of that unit in 2014 before it was combined with some other units. But in terms of his military doctrine, I really have no idea what it is because we don't really have any sort of online resources about that. So I guess it is a bit of a wild card. We'll just have to see how he conducts himself in this position of really high prestige. Now, besides the Central Military District, there are obviously the other 4 districts. So this includes the district in the east, so the Eastern Military District. So over here we have Rustam Muradov. He is the leader of that district. And it seems like this military district, most of the units within that district are fighting around the Vuhledar-Pavlivka area and also around the Donetsk front. So that is pretty interesting. I'm just giving some general information about the Russian command structure. Then you also have the Western Military District, which is being led by Yevgeny Nikiforov, and he's been in charge since January 23rd. And this includes some infamous units like the 1st Guards Tank Army, which suffered some pretty heavy losses around Izium. And as we know, they are fighting around Svatove at the moment. So in this general area, this is the 1st Guards Tank Army for all those that are interested. Now let's go back to the map. We also have the Southern Military District, which is led by Sergei Kuzhedov, and he was previously a commander of the Western District. And based on open source information, I'm pretty sure that they are fighting around Zaporozhye. So what this tells us is that there's a big emphasis from the Russian regular army on the Zaporozhye fronts, the Donetsk fronts, and Svatove fronts. The only fronts that are not really filled in with many Russian regulars at the moment is Kherson, where you just have like really a few that are stationed across the river, really dispersed over there, and then Bakhmut, where it's mainly the Wagner group. So that tells us a lot about how Russia's conducting the war as of now. Now, something interesting that's going to happen is that the Western Military District is going to be split up. This is old news, by the way, but I never had time to cover it. Basically, what this means is that the Western District over here, it was originally actually 2 districts. There was the Moscow Military District, which is the one over here, the one to the south, and then you had the Leningrad District, which is the one to the north, the one over here. So they were combined in a series of military reforms in 2010, but now it was reversed by Sergei Shoigu in a recent round of reforms. So now we are going to have the Moscow district and the Leningrad district as separate districts. Also in the same reforms, he ordered that there be a new army corps set up in Karelia along the Finnish border. So all of that is very interesting, and we're going to see how that plays out in the wider geopolitical realm, not even just in Ukraine, as we're seeing this restructuring of the Russian military following some of the situation that occurred in Ukraine. They're trying to adapt to it, trying to build up their army again, just for in lieu of potentially being a wider conflict that could occur. So all of that is very important to note. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later.